Record. So welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have Aziz's empty chair over there. So thank you so much for joining us on this virtual tour of Jerusalem, which is meant really as a highlight of our upcoming actual tour. I'm going to screen share that right with you. A Reason for Hope with Combatants for Peace, November 3rd to 13th. We already have a handful of signups and the registration deadline is August 3rd. So if you like what you see here today, I would urge you to check out that tour and sign up. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to our two fantastic tour guides. We have Aziz Abusara, who is also he's the co-owner of Mejdi Tours and a board member for Combatants for Peace, and Shai Goren, who is a tour guide with Mejdi Tours and also one of the lead activists in Combatants for Peace. So welcome to the two of you and thank you. I'm going to turn it over to you now.
Awesome. Oh, Shai, you here?
Yeah, I'm here. Should we start?
Working. Yes, well, it's good to see you. It's good to see everybody, and we're looking forward to this. This is the concept that we have of two people leading trips together, Israeli and Palestinian, isn't necessarily just presenting multiple points of view, but I think trying to understand things from not just our points of views, but our own community's point of views. And that's what we will try to do today as we do on our trips. And I think we are starting, we want to do something that really digs deep into a little bit of the history, but also trying to connect it to the current reality, situation, politics, all of that together. So we're going to make a mush out of it all and try to make things clearer, hopefully for you. Feel free again to ask us as we're going through, and I'll pass it to Shai from here.
Okay, thank you, Aziz, and hi, everybody. What we'd like to do to start with is to go a little bit in depth with the maps so we can have maybe a better understandings of what we're going to talk about. So just to begin with, we have a map here of the near Middle East, including Israel, Palestine, which are, let's say, the central part. To our north, post the Sea of Galilee, we have Lebanon, which is located here, where you see the cursor right now. Then we have Syria in this direction. We have Jordan right here. Then we have a Sinai Peninsula, which is controlled by Egypt, right in this direction. Within the country, or within the region, the state, we have two important groups that we need to talk about. And obviously, we're talking about the Israelis and the Palestinians. So when we're mentioning them, maybe I'll annotate, yeah, so this will be easier to understand. Let's talk a little bit about the West Bank, which is located pretty much here. This is the area of the West Bank, which is controlled right now by the Palestinian Authority. Yet there are about 500,000 Israelis that are living in the West Bank, and they are citizens of Israel. We're talking about the settlers in this area. And we can see that the West Bank is cutting the city of Jerusalem into two halves. And soon we're going to go in depth to talk about Jerusalem, what is East and West Jerusalem, and how is it possible that the city was kind of walled off for about 19 years. So imagine Berlin for some years, then the wall was taken off, and then it was put back again in another location. So let's say that the essence of what we want to talk about today is Jerusalem, and there is no place in the world like this city, which means to understand anything about the current events of the region, of the country, of Israelis and Palestinians, you have to go in the roots of Jerusalem. So that's the core of what we want to do. If we talked already about the West Bank, let's talk about obviously about Gaza, which I would assume would come up as well. So Gaza is right here. It's home to 2 million Palestinians, and then 3 million Palestinians in the West Bank itself. And let me show you kind of the borders of the state of Israel. Here's the Golan Heights, recognized by Israel, not so recognized internationally. And then with that, let's say we have what is the map. Okay, I don't know if I did a good drawing, but maybe. Let me clear the map a little bit. And with that, we're going to dive in. You see Aziz laughing. So I know.
Amazing drawing. I didn't know you were so talented with this.
You see? Okay. So what we would like to talk about today mostly is about the areas that are around the old city of Jerusalem. And we'll talk about the old city itself. When we're talking about the old city, we're talking about one of the biggest neighborhoods of Jerusalem. It's home to about 40,000 people still nowadays. But we're talking about, let's say, what was kind of the oldest part of the city. So here in this complex, we have Temple Mount, Al-Aqsa, which is the holiest site in Judaism, a very holy site in Islam. We have the Muslim quarter, which is around in this direction. We have the Christian quarter, which is pretty much here. And then we have the Jewish quarter. Hope my drawings are kind of over there. And of course, we have the Western Wall, which is in this direction that I just wrote. Now, when we're talking about the old city, it is not only the old city itself that is important to talk. It's also important to talk about the neighborhoods that are surrounding the old city. And the most important neighborhoods that we want to mention today are a couple. So we have Silwan, which is a very large neighborhood south of the old city of Jerusalem. And if Jerusalem is getting close to 1 million residents, then Silwan itself, which is located just a bit south, as you see, of the old city, south and a bit east, is home to about 30,000 Palestinians and also 600 Jews, which is an important number. And we have to talk about how are Jews living in Silwan and what are the current issues with that. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about Mount of Olives today, which is the large Jewish cemetery, which is located right here. And of course, we'll talk about the neighborhoods that are north of the old city, which are Baba Zar, which is located at new standings of that. So this is our tour today. We'll talk about it from multiple point of views. It's going to be Israeli and Palestinian within different groups. Obviously, there's many point of views. So as an Israeli, I'll try to show you some ideas and maybe narratives that I don't necessarily agree with, but they are popular within the country. We'll talk about that and try to break it down. Okay. Aziz, which site would we like to start with?
I think we should start at Al-Aqsa Mosque and talk about that. And I can start with sharing my screen for that, I think. Or not. I can't somehow find it. 1 second. Sorry, it'll take me just 1 second. Here we go. See, you are much more organized than me, buddy.
I have it too. You want me to start?
No, I got it.
Okay.
So, oh, I thought I shared my screen. Can you all see the screen? Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
You can see it, right?
yeah.
All right, just 1 second and I'll make it full. And so I wanted to start in Al-Aqsa Mosque, Dome of the Rock, which is the holiest place for Muslims in Palestine. It is the third holiest place for Muslims anywhere in the world. And that's for many reasons, but the most important reason, just so I can show you the place, we are looking at the southern mosque, or what's called Al-Masjid al-Qibli, the Qibla Mosque, and that's in the south of the compound. And then up to the north, you have the Dome of the Rock, here where a lot of people come to purify themselves before prayer. And then the place itself is quite larger. And it's important actually to indicate many people will mistaken the Al-Aqsa Mosque to say this is Al-Aqsa Mosque, and that is not true. Al-Aqsa Mosque in Islam, or by pretty much everyone in the Muslim world, is the whole compound, including the Dome of the Rock. So the holiness isn't only in one building. And just to explain how that's true, when I used to come to Al-Aqsa Mosque to pray now as a kid, we couldn't all fit inside the building here. So we would pray outside. And the way we see it is whether you pray outside, inside, in the Dome of the Rock, it is as if you are praying in the same place. Every prayer in Al-Aqsa Mosque counts as 500 prayers instead of a normal prayer. which I often joke about. Well, it's true. When I was a kid, I actually believed then I don't need to pray anymore than 4 prayers a year, because that will cover 5 a day. I was okay with math. I figured that much out. So my teachers were impressed with my math and not impressed with my piety and faith. But you can see, by the way, this is the Mount of Olives East, and there are so many important things about the mosque. I can just start maybe with a couple of the stories that explains why this place is important politically too. It became what it became because of politics too, which is when the Umayyad dynasty started in Islam. It had a problem with people who wanted to we'll come back to some of these, but I want to actually stop here. They had a problem with a division within the Muslim world, where one group, Abdullah ibn Zubayr, controlled Mecca, and they decided that Jerusalem will be the religious center instead of Mecca for that period. And that's when the Dome of the Rock was built. We are talking about 1,300 years ago, more than 1,300 years ago. The Dome of the Rock is actually one of the oldest Muslim shrines in the world that's still standing. The southern mosque that we saw earlier had been destroyed multiple times. This Dome of the Rock hasn't, which makes it an incredibly important place. It was built in a Byzantine style. It has an octagonal, partially because many of the engineers that Umayyads have hired were actually Byzantines. So it has some of that elements, but it does have also a lot of Islamic elements that we can go into. You can see here a lot of writings in Arabic. That's from the Quran, and you can see some here. A lot of it has to do with stories of Jesus, actually, because of Christianity was prominent at that time in Jerusalem. So writing the verses that relates to Mary and Jesus was important. And the story goes, when the dome was fully finished, that the gold on top of the dome wasn't originally part of the plan. By the way, the diameter of the Dome of the Rock is exactly the same as the diameter of the Holy Sepulchre, which we can see here. So interesting. But when they finished building, they had so much gold and didn't know what to do with it. And the story goes that they came to the king, the caliph, and they said, "What should we do with this gold?" And he said, "Well, maybe you can take it." And they said, "No, this was given to God. We can't take it." And that's how you ended up with the Dome of the Rock being gold. They said, "We will just give it to God by building a golden dome." I'm not sure I believe the story that they were giving so much gold, and they said no, we'll donate it. But the idea was, we'll impress everyone with this gold. People will come to see this place because of this golden dome. And they were pretty right, because when the Templars attacked Jerusalem 400 years later, they ended up, when they left Jerusalem, taking a lot of this gold with them. And the golden dome was not gold until 35 years ago. So it lasted for 800 plus years without having gold in it, on it until 35 years ago, when the king of Jordan, King Hussein, sold one of his palaces in Jordan to add gold on it. Here you see the Dome of the Chain, which is another one of my favorite spots. And I've been reading lately a lot about Al-Aqsa Mosque and history, and I'm showing you up here because there is an Islamic myth, story, legend, I don't know what you want to call it, that says that King David, who's a prophet in Islam, used to sit here to judge between people. And if Shai and I, for example, had a dispute, we would come here, bring our dispute before King David, and he would tell us to reach our hands up, and a chain would be lowered. That's why it's called Dome of the Chain. And whoever of us will reach the chain will be the one telling the truth. I love this story growing up, by the way, because I thought I will always win. I was the tallest kid in my class. And then my teachers told me that height didn't matter. It was about truth, not about height. I didn't like that answer. It killed my whole plan of being the tallest kid, being always a truth teller. But I actually thought to tell you about this because we're talking about connection, and Muslims see King David, Prophet David in Islam, is actually part of Jerusalem, part of the history of Jerusalem, and that this is where he sat to judge. In Islam, actually, it's believed that in the final day, judgment will be in Jerusalem, and that Mecca itself, Al-Kaaba, the most holy place in Islam, will be transported from Mecca to Jerusalem, where judgment will happen in the last day. But especially about 1,000 years ago, more or less, there's a lot of Jewish stories that have become adopted by the Muslim stories about Jerusalem as well. And you can see it's called in Arabic Israeliyat or in Islam, and some Muslims reject it, some Muslims accept it as part of the Islamic narrative. But it's really interesting how you see so much of our stories kind of come together from a religious point of view about this place and the importance of Jerusalem and of Dome of the Rock. It is the most unifying place for Palestinians, period, in the whole country, whether citizens of Israel, Gaza, Palestinians who live in Jordan. Not from a religious so much even point of view, even atheist Palestinians feel so strongly about this place. This is inside the Dome of the Rock, because it is seen as the one spot that has not been taken away. Even 67 war, it remained under Islamic control. It is seen as a cultural place, a religious place, and it's a place we still have ownership of. And so you see any issue, any problem happening, often directly involved with the Dome of the Rock, with the Al-Aqsa Mosque, with the compound. We are inside here, by the way. This is a rock where in Islam, it's where the Prophet Muhammad went up to heaven, where he met with God and was told that Muslims have to pray 5 times a day. It would be from this spot. And it's an incredible place. But this explains, I think, a little bit about how sensitive this place is, and how every time there is a clash in the Dome of the Rock or the Al-Aqsa Mosque, it is incredibly, this is inside the Southern Mosque, incredibly touchy, especially seeing soldiers, for example, walking in here with their boots, shooting tear gas inside. It is one of the things that will drive any Palestinian crazy, regardless of how religious they are. I would even add Christian Palestinians as well. Shai?
Yeah, okay. I would like actually to go back a little bit to the map just to give us an aerial shot of both the Dome of the Rock and the Western Wall, because I think they are kind of a classic dual explanation on my behalf. And to understand one, maybe you need to understand the other. So I want to connect it obviously to the things that Aziz said. And if we're mentioning the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa, of course, is a very holy site for Islam. It's also a very holy site in Judaism. And the question is, how do we see holiness maybe throughout the years, and what has happened to it, and what's happening with it right now? So I'm going to try run Jewish history, like 3,000 years of it, maybe 4,000 years of it, in maybe 2-3 minutes. Let's see if we can do that. First of all, the site of the Dome of the Rock talks about the rock, talks about the exact rock that Aziz showed us, that big white rock that's located underneath the Golden Dome. That rock, according to the Jewish faith, and according to most Muslims, I mean, they believe in that tradition as well, as far as I heard, talks about the binding of Isaac, talks about the tradition where Abraham, that was the first monotheistic, the first person to believe in one God, had kind of a test of faith by God himself. And about 4,000 years ago, he took his son Isaac to the rock that was here on top of this mount called Mount Moriah. He binds Isaac to that altar, and he's supposed to kill him. It's to show how much he loves God and how much he has respect for God. And pretty much a second before he slays his own son, God stops him at the last moment and tells him, Abraham, this was a test of faith. The idea was not that you're going to kill your own son. The idea was to see if you're willing to do something like that. And Judaism shouldn't celebrate anything like that. It shouldn't be a religion of war. It should be a religion of life. Chaim. How we say life in Hebrew. We say it when we toast glasses. I guess you saw that before. So from that moment, in Jewish history, we're talking about a very holy site, which means obviously that when King David is going to look for a site to put in the first temple, that's a site where he's going to do it. And then the first one is destroyed. I mean, David's son Solomon is the one to build it eventually. But when the first one is destroyed, then the second one is built, and the second one takes a little bit of time before King Herod would come in and would redo the place. So we see kind of a restructure of Temple Mount at first century AD. So we're talking about or first century BC. We're talking about 2,000 years ago already. And then the second temple is destroyed. And from the moment that the temple is standing exactly here, right, where the Dome of the Rock is standing nowadays, but from the moment the temple is destroyed, Judaism is going through an issue, let's say, through troubles. Imagine that you have a religion. The religion has a center of faith. The center of faith is in your capital, and that center of faith is destroyed and will not be built again. And a new, let's say, superpower takes over, which are the Romans. The Jews understand that, and they're looking for what they can do. And what they come up with, I think, is remarkable. The response at the time is not to continue praying at the destructed site of the temple, is to take one of the external walls. If you're looking at right now at the Temple Mount, then there are 4 external walls, right? There's one from the north, one from the east, one from the south, and another one from the west. And unlike what many people think, all 4 of them survived, or most of them, let's say. There is a southern one, there's an eastern one, very easy to see when you come visit the site. Also, you can see from here. But one of the rabbis is coming up with an idea. And he's saying that if we take one of the other walls, if we don't go to the destructed side of the dome of the temple at the time, if we'll take just the western wall, because that was the wall that was closest to the temple at the time, that will be the new center of Judaism. And then they're talking about a female form of God or the spirit of God called Shekhinah that will pretty much transfer from the area of the destructed temple to the wall itself. And that story pretty much kicks in. We have from that moment, from first century AD, we have 2,000 years of generation after generations of Jews that are coming all the way here to the Wailing Wall, right? They call it the Wailing Wall because people are coming over to cry, people are coming to pray, and they are worshiping this specific site. So it's not so much about the destructed temple anymore. It's getting to be the Western Wall and not even the entire wall. It's becoming this section of the wall, which is about 1/8, not the other ones, because the Mamluks about 800 years ago or so, they're building, or 700, they're building homes in what becomes the Muslim quarter. And so we get the Western Wall when Jews cannot even go up to Temple Mount and pray. And that situation continues through 1948, right, which is the War of Independence and the Nakba. But even that war brings the old city of Jerusalem, or leaves it under Jordanian hands. It would only be in 1967 when Israel will take over the entire old city of Jerusalem, including Temple Mount. And now, 54 years ago, when we come to that point, comes a question of what the Jews should do with the whole site of Temple Mount. And we see a division within Judaism. When the majority of the rabbis are talking about not only we shouldn't pray there, Jews shouldn't even enter the site. This is not what God intended. We will know what God would want us to go back. Some Jews are saying, more extreme, I would say we don't even need to be in the state of Israel. We're talking about extreme radical Orthodox Jews. But others are saying, okay, we should leave here, but make sure that you don't even visit the whole area of Temple Mount. And I think most Israeli Jews have never visited the site. And many of them don't even know that it's possible to visit. Now, another group of Jews, which are more right-wing, we can say, and have to do with the settler movement many times. It's not that they're not religious, they're very religious, but their rabbis came up with a different understanding. And the other understanding is not only Jews have to pray in Temple Mount, it's a sign of sovereignty. And this is critical, I think. This is a critical point to talk about, because we're going to talk about it today multiple times. And to understand the events that happened here in the last 2 months, we need to talk about that. We need to talk about sovereignty, about Jews who came from a minority group in the world that went through genocides, to a point that they, or we, are the majority in this region. And still being the majority, we are having issues of sovereignty. Because if you ask Jews who's in charge of Temple Mount, they're going to answer the Palestinians. These are the people that really make the call. These are the people that controls who can pray up on the mountain and who can't. Although the Israeli police is the one that's in charge, or maybe they share the mountain, we can say, with the Muslim organization, with the Waqf. But we have an issue here. We have one group of Jews. It used to be not very big, about 54 years ago, but that group became bigger and bigger, that's claiming that if we came back from all over the world and we want to pray at the holy spots, then with all due respect to Tel Aviv or Haifa, Jerusalem is where it's at. And with all due respect to the Western Wall, that was second best back 2,000 years ago. The real claim is to rebuild the third temple up here at Temple Mount, and that movement is getting stronger and bigger, and we have to realize that. So when we're talking about the events that happened here 2 months ago in the old city, we're talking about a parade that marched into the city. We're talking about it as we're going to go into tour to Damascus Gate. I have a couple of images for you, so maybe we'll test them, we'll check them out. And with that, we saw a couple of images that has shook the world, we can say. Let's see. Okay, so here's the presentation. I think you should be able to see it. And with that, we see some images that I think were kind of off at Temple Mount, right, Al-Aqsa. We saw that riots started at Temple Mount. The police claimed it was Palestinians. Palestinians claimed it was the police who started it. But no matter what, the police, exactly as Aziz mentioned, they walked inside of the mosque, both the dome and the southern mosque. They shot tear grenades. They shot other ammunition inside. And we saw a couple of those images in what is the holiest site in the region, one of the holiest in the world. And with that, we saw the march continuing in. And here's an image you can see of young Jews who are celebrating the day of the unification of Jerusalem, right? The city that was divided for 19 years from 48 to 67, then it was reunified. They're celebrating that. And between the shooting, or amongst the shooting between the Palestinians and the police, one of the trees up on Temple Mount caught on fire. And with that, we saw this video that I tried to play from you from the presentation. I think you should be able to see it. Okay. Okay, so what are we seeing in this image? We're seeing young Israeli kids, teenagers, they're celebrating the unification of Jerusalem. They just walked into the plaza of the Western Wall. They would celebrate regardless of if they would see fire on top of Temple Mount. One of the Palestinians shot shot something that started the fire on top of the mountain, but that doesn't matter anymore who shot it first. What's important is that the tree is caught on fire. Those kids are watching Temple Mount burning, or at least pieces of it, at least the trees, and they're celebrating. And that video has went viral like you cannot imagine, and sparked one of the escalation that we saw here in the last couple of years. So it's not only about religion, it's not only about the holy sites, but definitely within this conflict, they kick in. And to solve that issue or conflict between the Israelis and Palestinians will be impossible to do without solving the issues regarding Temple Mount. And that also leads us to the peace agreements that we try to have. Back in the year 2000, 2008, we're even able to find some ways to divide Jerusalem along those agreements, but throughout them, there was no real solution that both sides could agree upon what to do with the holy sites themselves and what to do with Temple Mount and Al-Aqsa. And until we come to that point, then we're pretty much stuck with the current situation that is infuriating both sides. And both of them feel like something is not going okay, right? Palestinians as why are Jews coming up to the mountain? Jews are saying, why can we not pray at our holiest site? Okay, that was a bit more than 3 minutes, but I hope we gave some, okay.
A little bit. As you can tell, both Shai and I like to talk, so we'll this could last for a bit longer than we planned. Now, can we go to Damascus Gate photos? And while we're doing that, I do want to answer maybe something you brought up just now at the end, Shai, and maybe answer a question. Somebody's asking, where are the people in all these photos? Depends when the photo was taken. The ones I was showing were taken in the midst of the pandemic, so there were no people there. Are people allowed in? Tourists allowed in? Yes, people are allowed in. Both genders can pray. There are, in the time of prayer, separation between genders in Al-Aqsa Mosque and in the Western Wall. On Friday, for example, men will pray in the Southern Mosque and women will pray in the Dome of the Rock, one of the only times women get the better deal, in the sense I think the Dome of the Rock is the most beautiful place. But yes, people can go in. Tourists can go in, but not inside the building. They can go into the plaza outside, but unless you are Muslim, you can't get inside to the building. That only started 20 years ago. after the second intifada, because the reopening of tourists being able to come in was done by the Israeli police and without coming to an agreement with the Waqf. And so part of their response was, okay, you can let people get into the outside, but not into the inside. Um, that's part of it. But I want to answer maybe something you did. Sulaiman Mosque in honor of the temple. Okay, we'll come to that maybe in a little bit. But I want to answer something you asked. Why can't Jews go to pray in the temple? And part of the reason is exactly what you already mentioned earlier, Shai, is the people who do want to go to pray in the temple are often not the people who believe in coexistence, are not the people who believe in shared society. I mean, interestingly, actually, the Orthodox community in Jerusalem, Jewish Orthodox community, were strongly against the parade, the flag parade, which was a hate fest. People screaming through Palestinian neighborhoods in Jerusalem, "Death to Arabs." And the Orthodox community, the ultra-Orthodox community, many of them spoke out against. Actually, there were Arabic ads that flyers that they spread around saying we are against this parade, this is wrong. So when I think of Jews who want to go to pray, these are the ones who do. And to be honest, considering the power dynamic, considering the Israel is in power, considering that these guys have more influence on the governments of Israel, even today still have a lot of influence with the new government and the government of Israel. You see Itamar Ben-Gvir here. You can see my thing. If you can point out who's Itamar Ben-Gvir, that's a guy who last week on TV said that Arabs should be transferred out of Israel, should be ethnically cleansed out of Israel. He's a member of Knesset. He is supported by the former Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu. He's a guy who wants people to pray in the mosque. So even if I could go to the Muslim religious authority and say, look, let's find out a way to make it work out, no one is going to trust this guy to do it. And especially looking at the other place where that happened, which is Hebron, where from an Israeli maybe point of view, it's a success, or from a Palestinian point of view, it's a disaster. Half of the mosque was taken away to create a synagogue. Muslims who go into the mosque have to be fully searched. There's metal detectors into the mosque, not into the synagogue. The whole area is under heavy, heavy military presence. So those things, these people who are calling for Jews to pray in the mosque are also calling to Judaize Jerusalem, to get rid of the Arab, to kick us out. There are people in the municipality in Jerusalem who are part of this group that are openly talking about how do we create policies on laws that can demolish Palestinian homes and make their presence and demographic numbers in Jerusalem low. And so as I hear all of that, it makes it very hard to reason, even if I wanted to negotiate and I wanted to go to the Muslim authority and say, the Waqf, and say, let's figure out something. There is no way they can feel even comfortable having the conversation, forget even coming to a compromise. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. I think Damascus, what's been happening in Damascus Gate is a good example. If you want to put the photos, and I'll finish what I'm saying in a second. This is the heart of East Jerusalem market, what you're looking at now. This is how you enter the main market in East Jerusalem. This is a place, if I'm in Jerusalem, walking around anywhere, I'm probably going to have to cross this area at least a couple times in any given day. It is the most important, I would say, gate for Palestinians in Jerusalem. And in the last couple of months, it has become the police headquarters in some ways. You are not allowed to hang out here. You are not allowed to sit in this area. You're not allowed to gather whatsoever. If you're entering or exiting, you're getting fully searched by the police, which you can see the border police over there. This gate, by the way, was built by Solomon the Magnificent, who is an Ottoman leader in the 16th century. And historically, it always been an important gate. It faces toward Damascus. That's why we call it Damascus Gate in English, but it's in Arabic called Bab al-Amud, which means the gate of the columns, which goes to more ancient times, because this is not the first gate there. Below it, there's an ancient gate that goes to the Roman era. And so Arabic kept kind of the more ancient name for it. But this has become the heart, actually, of a lot of the conflict. The police every now and then sends a skunk water tank to go and spray the area, which I have a really hard time understanding. So, well, the reason is so nobody hangs out there, because it will smell horrible. And I have a hard time understanding, because the concept of we all fighting over the city we love, if you love something, you don't spray it with skunk water just to stop people from hanging around in it. And then the whole democratic aspect, the Israeli government claimed they couldn't stop this hate fest of death to Arabs passing through here because it's a democracy, but then have a hard time letting Palestinians gathering here, forget, not even going, not saying anything remotely close to death to anybody, and still not allowed to do that. And that's a reality of being kind of unequal in your own city, or from a Palestinian view, being under occupation.
So let's talk about the same event from some of the Israeli point of view. And as Aziz mentioned, we definitely have Itamar Ben-Gvir, a more radical, or the most radical member of the Israeli Knesset, who was pushing to pass the parade, right? It's called the Parade of the Flags, or the Dance of the Flags, to be passing through Damascus Gate, which is the main entrance to the Palestinian part of the city, as Aziz mentioned, to walk through the Muslim quarter on the way to Western Wall, which obviously there's other ways to do that, right? You can walk around it, and there's other ways to do that, but this comes back to the issue of sovereignty. And Itamar Ben-Gvir tries to push it to maybe the most sensitive part in the Israeliness, and that's the feeling that the Israelis are still not the sovereign group here. And he has kind of a very, how would I call it, naive question. Obviously, he's not naive, and the question is not naive, but he's asking, since when it's a crime to walk with an Israeli flag in the capital of Israel? And I hear many Israelis from the center, and even from the center left, that are kind of quoting Itamar Ben-Gvir and other radical members of the Knesset, and they say, come on, it's the flag of the country. We live in Israel, so what is the matter? And that is the big question. If Jerusalem was divided and still acts as a divided city, when 40% of the people living in the city are Palestinians, and they are residents of the city, they're not, or the country, and they're not citizens of the country, and to raise a Palestinian flag, which is not a crime in Israel, when Mahmoud Abbas, president of the PA, came over multiple times to the house of the Prime Minister of Israel, he was greeted with Palestinian flags. So it's not a crime to do that. But when a Palestinian youth would do that and would raise a Palestinian flag, he would get either stopped or arrested, or just the flag will be taken away, or sometimes beaten. So we're talking about the question of sovereignty. And what we're seeing here is an attempt of the police in the last events of Ramadan. This was taken on the first day of Ramadan in May, or April was it, this year, so just 2 months ago. And the police tried to stop Palestinians from even gathering around the area of Damascus Gate. That didn't work, because the Palestinians went on demonstrations when most of them were non-violent at the time. And after 2 weeks of that, the police decided to change their mind, or to change the decision, and to take off those barracks. But when that parade of the flags was supposed to continue, and here's one of the images of that, it was just a couple of days before Netanyahu's regime was about to fall, and another one tried to thrive. And we expected, and I would believe people from the left wing in Israel expected, that once the government would change, we will not see many events like that anymore. Because Itamar Ben-Gvir and the right wing and Smotrich and other parliament members will not be in the government anymore, which means that their power and their time in office is finished. So a new government was formed in Israel about, 3 weeks ago. And one of the first things that happened afterwards was the same parade. The parade got an approval by the police and by the Minister of Police. He's from the Labour Party, which are in the new government. They decided to allow it. Maybe they changed the route a little bit. But when it came down to that, the feeling was that Israelis can walk with an Israeli flag whenever they want. That was the core of that. Many people gave another argument, and they say, okay, there was also a gay parade. in Jerusalem. Jerusalem celebrates gay pride every year for the last 20 years. One of the events in 2015, a young girl was stabbed to death at gay pride. And ever since, more people come over to march. In the last years, when it's not COVID days, we had 25,000 people. They're marching in the city. Obviously, that parade doesn't go inside of the ultra-Orthodox neighborhood just to despite and to show that we can march in the middle of that. But when it comes to Jewish sovereignty, it would lead to that. And that leads many times to the idea that if we're here, then we need to show our force and we need to show who we are. And we need to show the Arabs that we're not afraid to march whenever we want in our capital city with our flag of the nation, which is an argument that I think many of the Israelis will agree with. And we have very few people who see Jerusalem in a different way, to see Jerusalem as the home of two nations, to see Jerusalem as the place where people should have other rights other than the parade itself. Okay.
Should we check just a couple of questions we have before we continue? Quickly
Please.
answer them. Did Suleiman build the mosque to honor the temple and Jews because it has been used as a trash heap? The answer is no. It was Umar ibn al-Khattab who built it in 638 AD. And at that time, it was in ruins, but it wasn't Suleiman. And it was, there are different stories on why he chose the place. But the point is, he was looking to where did the Prophet come to Jerusalem? Where did he lead prayer with the other Muslim, or not the other Muslim, the other prophets, which is Moses and Jesus and everybody, because Islam actually believes in all of these. And he was eventually guided to that location, which was in ruins since it was destroyed by Titus, by the Roman Empire. And the second one, Shai, if you want to answer, it says, which administration makes sure non-Muslims do not pray on the plaza? Is that the Waqf or the Israeli police?
Yeah, so according to the Israeli law, Muslims are supposed to enter to the area of the plaza of the Western Wall. When I led tours there in the past, I was asked, do you have any Muslims in the tour? And I asked, why? Why would you ask that? And they said, okay, if they're Muslims, then we have to kind of double check. And the best answer I can give to this question is that it's not official. There's nothing formal. If Muslims would come in with a different ID, if they have a British passport, then perhaps they'll be allowed in. If they are Palestinians, especially from the West Bank or Gaza, then it will be much, much more difficult for them to get in. But I also know friends from the West Bank that fought for the right, and they said, okay, I want to talk to the chief of the police in the area, and I want to see why can't I enter. And then at one point, they were allowed to go in. And I think that's the answer to many of the things that you'll ask about the Middle East. Yeah, the formal question or the formal answer is not necessarily how things look on ground. I also want to answer the question about, here it is, where is the part of the wall that was supposed to be set aside for egalitarian prayer? So I'll show you that. Remember that Judaism has kind of many faces. The main part that you'll see in Israel is the Orthodox one, which means that your only way to get married is through an Orthodox rabbi. There's no other way really to do that. Reform and conservative, which are the majority of US Jews, or Canada Jews, North Americans, are not really recognized by the state of Israel. Not their Judaism and not the way that they practice Judaism. That means that in the praying plaza right here, we have a men's section. Yeah, it's right here and also goes underneath this arch. We have a pretty small women's section right here. And according to the laws of Israel, women are not allowed to pray wearing a talit, the praying shawl. They're not allowed to put on tefillin, the black box, Jewish GoPro is how I call them. And they're not allowed to read from the Torah. After a dispute of about 30 years, an organization called Women of the Wall tried to change that. There was an agreement that another section of the wall will be open. So back in 2015, I believe, they opened a new section supposed to be the egalitarian section. But then the ultra-Orthodox parties in the government kind of lost it, and they decided that they want to stop this whole project from happening, and nothing really changed ever since, which means you can still enter, but it doesn't look like something that people would really come to. And maybe the new government will try to touch that, as the ultra-Orthodox parties, for the first time in many years, are not a part of the coalition, which means that we might see a change. Anyway, the egalitarian section is this section of the wall, just here, as you can see. Okay.
Should we move to Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah quickly, and then we can answer more questions. And I got a couple of things I can show you. So here we go, Sheikh Jarrah. So moving into Sheikh Jarrah, the same stuff that was going on in the last 2 months in the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, Damascus Gate was happening in Sheikh Jarrah. And again, stories of history often are used to politicize things today. So the fact that some religious Jews believe that an important rabbi was buried in Sheikh Jarrah, which we can argue whether that is true or not, is used as one of the reasons why Judaizing Sheikh Jarrah is important. But also a law that is discriminating against the Palestinians in East Jerusalem is used to basically evict or displace, is more accurately, people from this neighborhood in Jerusalem. This is Sheikh Jarrah. It's actually a small neighborhood. This house is probably the most known in Sheikh Jarrah as the focal point of the fighting over there. There are 3,000 plus people living in Sheikh Jarrah. 28 of these families are refugees, Palestinian refugees from 1948, and the UN actually gave them housing in Sheikh Jarrah in return that they give up their refugee status. So these are families from West Jerusalem and from Haifa and these places that agreed per a letter or per disagreement with the United Nations saying we will, okay, fine, we lost our homes, and now we will not get any assistance anymore from the UN. We will not get any assistance from anybody. In return, we can build homes in this land that the UN and the Jordanian government gave people. You could argue it could be like some kind of form of resettlement plan. However, after 1967, the law in Israel said, in 1970, I think it was a law that passed that basically said Jews who owned anything pre-1948, anywhere in the country, in East Jerusalem included, can go and claim that land. A previous law have denied the same right to Palestinians, who said if you were at an enemy state at the end of the war, then you cannot reclaim your land. Well, if you were a Palestinian in East Jerusalem that was under Jordan, Jordan was considered an enemy state. Therefore, these families cannot go and claim their homes in West Jerusalem and in Haifa, while a Jewish organization that is a right-wing organization can come and claim this neighborhood. It's all Palestinian until this organization comes, and slowly you can see where these homes are. They start to come and say, here's what we want. These are the homes we want to take, and slowly evicting more and more families. It's done very slowly. Some of the house have been evicted, some of the house not, but it's done very slowly, I believe on purpose, so it doesn't cause too much of a noise. One house at a time, two houses at each time. And Sheikh Jarrah has become one of the main struggle points. Some will want to say it's a property dispute. I think that's extremely insulting to call it a property dispute, because property dispute that's based on laws that make us unequal, but also that the two main organizations that's leading the struggle openly say our goal is to Judaize the city. That is our goal, is to make a potential two-state solution impossible by having many Jews living in East Jerusalem. And I've actually gone on a tour with the settlers like 15 years ago, just as this was starting, just to understand their perspective. I didn't tell them I was a Palestinian because I don't think they would have appreciated that. I was this good American boy trying to use the best accent I could as an American. So I didn't talk much because I knew they'll catch my accent at some point. But it was amazing going in and hearing what they say. And they were very open, honest about, look, our goal is to take over and to make sure no two-state solution ever happen. No Palestinian capital in East Jerusalem can ever happen. And that's the purpose of why we are here. And it's important to say this is not only in Sheikh Jarrah. This is also happening in places like Silwan. The same law is exactly used for these homes here in Batn al Hawa in Silwan, as you can see. And in the middle of 100% Palestinian neighborhood, these people come with heavy military protection, and end up taking over these neighborhoods slowly, one building at a time. Changing facts on the ground makes it really intolerable to live in that area as a Palestinian, because you're living in a military zone, because these guys come with their own support of and protection of military. Shai?
Okay. I want to take us through just a map of the division of Jerusalem, because I think that could maybe add some just to what Aziz said. First of all, I have to say that as an Israeli, to try to give the Israeli perspective here in Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan is not an easy task for me. I often go to the demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah, and I have my way and understanding of how things are. So this is not easy, but I'll try to give an explanation of how the majority of Israelis see the concept of Sheikh Jarrah and what's going on. I don't think so many are familiar with the facts, as it's a kind of complicated story and not so many went into the details. So I'll try to explain. Imagine that until 1948, the city lives as kind of one group, one organ. There's no East and West Jerusalem. There's no real division in the city. It doesn't mean that Jews and Palestinians live happily ever after, and they don't even live in the same neighborhood. But you have one Palestinian neighborhood here, another Jewish one here, another one there. So they're all around. What happens during the 1948 war is that we see a division line in the city for the first time. About 2,000 Jews who live in the used to live in the eastern part of Jerusalem are evicted from their homes, including Sheikh Jarrah, the Jewish quarter, and Silwan, as is mentioned, and they have to move to West Jerusalem. And about 30,000 Palestinians who used to live in the western neighborhoods of Jerusalem are also evicted from their homes, and they have to move into the eastern part of Jerusalem. And then Jordan takes the eastern part of the city, what you can see here in orange. Then Israel takes the western part of the city, what you can see in blue. And the question is, what happens next? For the Jewish families who lose their homes, also in Sheikh Jarrah, and it doesn't necessarily have to be home. Sometimes they buy an area and they didn't even build a home in, but they lost the property that they used to have. They get compensation. Almost all those families are being compensated through the possession of Palestinian families. There's a law, as is mentioned, from 1950, talks about the absentee property. There is compensation to those Jewish families. Now, if this would complete the situation, we won't see another war, and these would be the borders of the country, we wouldn't really hear about any of that even today. But what happens next, of course, is the war in 1967, and in that war, Israel takes over the eastern part of East Jerusalem, and now, through the law that is mentioned from 1970, there's a way for Jews to go back to the homes that they left behind. Some of those homes are here in Sheikh Jarrah, you see in the northern part of the old city. Some others are here in Silwan. We're talking about thousands of Jews that were kicked out. We're talking about maybe dozens or hundreds of homes that they have an ability to go back. Now, I have to say, if it was the real descendants, the original descendants of the Jews from 1948, maybe the story would look a bit different. But I don't know even one situation, even one scenario, when the actual descendants are the one to go back to the homes. Somehow, there are 4 organizations that end up taking the ownership of those houses, and they use the Israeli law in order to take back homes that used to belong to Jews. And this, I think, is a critical point also for understanding what the Israelis think about Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan. The fact that this is going according to the Israeli law, and the fact that Jews used to live here, is making many Israelis to think and to say very out loud, what is the problem here? We had a war in 1948. The Palestinians lost the war. They have no right to go back into the things that they left behind. This is how wars look like. If you follow world news, you saw that a couple of days ago, there was a decision in Poland, which made, obviously, Israel furious. But the decision was that Poland and the government is not going to compensate Jews, obviously, many of them are in Israel, that has escaped from Poland during the Second World War. They're not the people who did the war. If you have a problem, go to the Nazis. They're not going to be the one compensating you. And of course, Israel is pushing against it, and there are speeches now of Israeli ministers against the Poles. But these are the understandings of the Israelis. What happened in 1948 is one story. If you got a home, if you lost a home, that's one thing. But the problem is that those two laws kind of continue one another, right? It's not only Palestinians who lose their home in 1948, it's the same law which is not enabling them to go back into their homes, which is one thing, and the law which is allowing the Israelis to do that. Now, if you follow Israeli politics, you'll know that the Supreme Court in Israel has been under attack, under a severe attack from the right wing of Israel for the last 20, 25 years. It has to be when a Supreme Court judge called Aaron Barak in the 1990s during the Rabin administration has pushed some very liberal ideas into the Supreme Court, and it's perceived by the Israelis as a leftist organization. Some people call it a branch of Meretz party, which is considered left-wing in Israel, although they're not as left as you would imagine. Anyway, when the Israelis are talking about it, they say, what's the problem here? There is a law of Israel. The Supreme Court of Israel, the one that is so leftist, is the one to make the decision. So what do you want? And I think obviously they're losing kind of the greater picture in that, which is what Aziz mentioned to us before. And that image is the one of what is happening with the area around the old city of Jerusalem. And here we can see that, right? We can see the continuity of a Jewish settlement in Silwan. Here we have about 500 Jews who are living in this part of Silwan. Another 100 are living here in an area called Batan El Hawa. To them, maybe soon more Israeli Jews will be added. There's a similar story to what's happening in Sheikh Jarrah is taking place. Similar story here in Ras El Amud, Mountain of Olives, and here you see kind of a connection. And at one point, when we'll go back to peace talks, if we'll go back to the peace talks, then this group of Jews will say, hey, we're here. There's no way to really divide Jerusalem. Right now, we're talking about 3,000. I don't know if this number is enough or the number would grow, but if it would be 10,000 or maybe 30,000, obviously the map would look different and the division of Jerusalem will not be something possible anymore. And I have to say, even if it's not for the division of Jerusalem, we have to ask ourselves, right, this very honest question. If we are opening the cases from 1948 and we're looking at the ownership files of who lived where, then we have to ask ourselves, how is it possible that we're doing it in a one-sided way? That we're allowing Jewish organizations to claim back property, which is not theirs. They bought the rights to it. It wasn't theirs to begin with, but we're not enabling Palestinians to do the same. I don't know any, not even one Israeli Jew, maybe a few, but not many, that would allow or push for that to happen and would bring Palestinians back into their possession. That's something that, according to most Israelis, is not even a question. So how are we enabling such a president to happen? And that's kind of a greater picture than that. And the new government of Israel would have to see what they do. Supreme Court is about to meet on August 2nd and decide what's going to happen with those families who already lost the cases in Sheikh Jarrah.
Okay. Right. So should we move to some questions? We got, I think, about 30 minutes for questions. We received a few. We'll try to answer as many as we can. Feel free to still send us some more, but we're probably not going to be able to hit all of them on time. Maybe we can spend a little bit longer, Shai and I, if he's up for it, to try to answer more questions. So let's see. What question do we want to start with? Do you want to pick a question to start with, or I'll ask you a question, Shai, and maybe the two of us can relate to it. What do you think, and how do you explain the explosion of the social media world's campaign for Sheikh Jarrah? How and why does a small neighborhood in Jerusalem get attention of millions around the world?
It's a great question. And just yesterday, I visited Sheikh Jarrah, and we talked about it with Salah Diab from the neighborhood. What does he think also was a part of that? I think it's a combination of a couple of things that kind of landed at the same, at maybe the right time for that. When you take just the isolated story of Sheikh Jarrah and you bring it outside of conflict, occupation of Israel-Palestine, and you hear only about the facts that are happening within the neighborhood, I think it's very difficult to stay indifferent to the issue of Sheikh Jarrah. So when you talk to Israelis about it, they often say something, okay, something like, yes, okay, so this is in Sheikh Jarrah, but what's happening with Palestinian violence and terrorism would always try to add something. But still, the story of Sheikh Jarrah specifically, we're talking about 28 Palestinian refugee families who live in areas, I mean, these are tiny apartments. All of a sudden comes a huge organization that we don't know much about. This organization, the Nahalat Shimon International, they're listed in Delaware, in the States, because that's the place where you can list an organization without giving much information about. And they're bringing their lawyers and they're bringing millions of dollars to this story, trying to push against those families. So just the story itself, I think, is one thing. Having said that, add to that social media, which was a huge part of this kind of explosion in Sheikh Jarrah. One video, I think, went extremely viral. Aziz just showed us the house. He talked about one of the most famous homes in Sheikh Jarrah. It's the home of the El Kurd family that was evicted in 2008. And Mona El Kurd from that family, she asked a Jewish man that lives there, Jacob, she asked him, Jacob, why are you stealing this home? And he answered something like, if I won't steal this home, then someone else would steal this home, which is really, how can you come up with an answer like that? But that's exactly what he did. And all of that sparked into the neighborhood. And add to that also what was the political reality of this region at the time. The fact that there were supposed to be elections in the Palestinian Authority and kind of last second, they are avoided or abolished by Abbas. Add to that Netanyahu was in big trouble at the time. So he had an incentive to maybe start a fire in Sheikh Jarrah, and Itamar Ben-Gvir, that Aziz mentioned before, decides to open his office in the middle of Sheikh Jarrah. So all those things are added together. I guess the Israeli government at the time thought that they could earn something from this explosion in Sheikh Jarrah. And I think some of the Palestinian families in Sheikh Jarrah saw this as an opportunity to bring their story into world eyes.
Yeah, I agree. The only thing I would add is also you mentioned Mona al-Kurd and her brother. The two of them have become such a personalities, social media stars. They're very good on camera. They've been doing this since they were 10 years old. There are videos of them since they were kids, media interviewing them because of the first time, the 13 years ago, the takeover of their first house in, I think, 2009. So these two have become spokespeople for the Sheikh Jarrah. And Muna, I think on Instagram has like over 1 million followers.
Yeah.
And
after she was arrested, another 300,000 just after the day of arrest.
Yeah. And her brother got hundreds of thousands of followers also, both on Instagram and on Twitter. So the two of them are really well known, and that has helped promote it. I think also because the Sheikh Jarrah thing is spreading, it wasn't just Sheikh Jarrah. It was Sheikh Jarrah, it was Al-Aqsa, it was Silwan, it was Wadi Joz. There's so many neighborhoods in Jerusalem that are facing the same thing. And Sheikh Jarrah became the main first issue, perhaps. And everyone understood in Jerusalem, it's not going to stop here. That solidified more support. Also, because of what happened in Al-Aqsa Mosque, many Arab influencers for the first time actually felt the pressure to do something, to say something. And so some influencers who had not hundreds, like tens of millions even of followers have started talking. The famous story of Bella Hadid, I think, who has 49 or 50 million followers. She started talking about Gaza, and then eventually others as well, but also Arabs in Jordan, in Egypt, starting using their influencer thing. People who are not into politics at all started actually using that and bringing in Sheikh Jarrah's stories. And so that spread the story much more. Do you want to pick a question now?
Yeah, I'll pick one. I have a direct message that says, I feel that you should say clearly the asymmetry is that Palestinians cannot claim a return to their West Jerusalem homes. That's a request, I think. So I'm saying it very explicitly and clearly. We have a question here about, so we have a question about, was there violence by the right-wing marchers at that March of the Flags against the ultra-Orthodox protesters. So I'm not sure if I understood the question because they're from pretty much the same group. Yeah, we're talking about two groups of Jews that were in the parade. But let's take this opportunity and talk about the ultra-Orthodox community of Jerusalem, which for many years was less interfered politically in the issues in Jerusalem and were not really perceived as the right wing. The right wing was what we call national religious, people who live mostly in areas of the West Bank, but not only. And that has changed in the last couple of years. And we started to see more ultra-Orthodox within right-wing marches, within clashes against Palestinians, attacks against Palestinians. This is something pretty new. And the ultra-Orthodox community, not only in Jerusalem, is trying to struggling with understanding that. How can they explain to the Palestinians in Jerusalem that the ultra-Orthodox are not against them? And I saw actually letters that were written about 2 months ago and tried to have meetings between the rabbis of the ultra-Orthodox communities saying, leave us out of this question, or us and Palestinians, we have no problems, so what can we do? But we do see a change. And that might be because many of the settlers are ultra-Orthodox, and that is making them, or in one way, they're coming up more right-wing because of that, because they live in an area that some of the left wings want to be evicted, and they don't want to have. So I think we see some change in that. But enough about this. Yeah. What other questions we have about this?
All right. So here's one that I think we should take. This program was presented as a tour of Jerusalem. I presume the Christian sites would be given some attention as well, but that hasn't been the case. Why not? Usually, actually, we do include the Christian sites because it is important. Even Shai and I have talked about it before. As time kind of went, we didn't, but mainly we didn't because we decided to go more into what's happening today in Jerusalem in areas like Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan, and connecting it to ancient history. So we try to kind of go history and its effect on what's going on in the last few months, especially in Jerusalem. Now, with that being said, I think at least from a Palestinian perspective, I'm always cautious of how people yes, talking about a tour of Jerusalem is important to include always the Christian sites, but I'm cautious about how people like to divide Palestinians into Christians and Muslims as if the Christian community is not part of the Palestinian community. And that's not accurate in any way. I would always like to remind people the founders of one of the most important political parties in Palestine was Christian Palestinian, George Habash. Actually, all the leaders of the Popular Front in the beginning were Christians. Many still are in the Popular Front. Even within the Fatah movement, there were many Christians as well. George Habash, Naif Hawat made the Democratic Front as well. Wadi Haddad, I can go on and on. And so often I feel when we're talking about Palestine, so when I talk about Sheikh Jarrah, I don't feel I'm talking about Muslims. When I'm talking about Silwan, I don't feel I'm talking about Muslims. I feel that I'm talking about Palestinians, and that includes both Christians and Muslims. Now, if we are to bring one maybe issue, it's not as up to date, is there's issue of property, also problems for the Christians, Christian Palestinians. But the biggest problem for Christian Palestinians is that church owns a lot of that property, and these churches are not run by Palestinians. In some case, for example, the Greek Orthodox Church is the biggest owner of land for Arab Christians, Palestinian Christians, and the patriarch is Greek, who can decide to sell some of the property to settlement organizations. And it's created a lot of problems within the Christian community who is opposed to that. So that's an big internal issue within the Christian community that opposes those kind of sales, and have actually many boycotted the patriarch who made that decision. You had a few years ago a big fight between the Jerusalem municipality and the church in Jerusalem, the churches in Jerusalem, over taxation of their property. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre closed its doors to tourists, saying, well, if you're going to ask us to pay, then you benefit a lot more from us than you can imagine. And eventually, the government had to intervene and stop the Jerusalem municipality from demanding taxes from the church. So there are some issues, but I think in the last few months, at least, those were not the main issues, and that's why we chose the route that we did today. On our in-person tours, we do talk quite a bit about the Christian history, because you can't walk anywhere in Jerusalem without connecting to some Christian history. So that's, and that will be November 3rd to 13th. Anyone who's listening, that's when we'll run our in-person tour that will cover quite a lot. I was asked, I'm unfamiliar with the Christian. I just want to do that because it's related. I'm unfamiliar with the Christian Palestinians. Are they allowed to worship freely in Gaza, in the PA, in Israel? Worship-wise, yes, in all three they are. In Israel, they are able to worship more or less freely. Within the West Bank, they are worshiping freely. I believe in Gaza as well. Their challenges isn't into where to worship freely. It's in the same challenges me as a Palestinian face in Ramallah or in Bethlehem. It's a freedom of movement. For example, if you are a Christian in Gaza, are you going to be able to come for Easter to Jerusalem? The chances of you getting a permit is almost non-existent to be able to do that. So their issue isn't out of necessarily faith, it's an issue of them being Palestinians.
Okay, Aziz, I'll answer a question, then I'll ask you one. We have a question. Is there a way to change the Israeli law in interest of peace or force the sale of the ownership to the Palestinian residents, I assume, of Sheikh Jarrah? That's the question. The answer is, there is a way to do that. I mean, to pass a law in the Knesset, you need a majority, and then the law is changed. But is there likelihood for that to happen? Not, I don't think so. I don't think the current government or the former one for sure not. There's no real way to pass it. What could really stop the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah is interference of the government, which means the government can come in and expropriate, can seize the area, and then grant it to the Palestinian families. I think there is some change that's what happened, especially with international pressure. And we also know that back in 2009, the evictions stopped in Sheikh Jarrah for 8 years. Imagine who was the president in America for those 8 years and who was Secretary of State in those 8 years. So in Obama and then Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State administration, we know that Hillary Clinton addressed the Israeli government and talked about how she doesn't want to see any evictions in Silwan and Sheikh Jarrah, and then they stopped for 8 years. So we're assuming that under Biden administration, a similar thing could happen. We have another one here. Am I understanding correctly that neither Israeli families nor Palestinian families are the original owners or descendants of owners of the particular homes? This is a much more complicated story, as the Palestinian families are claiming for ownership and they're going to the Israeli courts claiming for that. The Israeli courts are refusing to check the documents from what was the case in the 1970s, and they're going with what is the case in the last 20 years. But I want to emphasize that the descendants of the Jews who lived in the area are not the people who are going into those homes, and are not the people who are trying to evict the Palestinian families from their homes. They sold the rights or they lost the rights to Jewish right-wing organizations, and they're the one. Those organizations are the ones that have the claims for Sheikh Jarrah and for Batan el-Hawa in Silwan. Aziz, I'll ask you, what has been the effect of the US moving their embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem under the Trump presidency? You want to answer that?
Maybe we can make that a little bigger question, and I'll answer that, but add to it that what are progressives in Israel and Palestine views, and are they energized by the changes in the US? Are they aware of the ground shifting in the US, including among Jewish Americans? So I think when Trump decided to move the embassy to Jerusalem, wasn't a surprise so much for many Palestinians. It was very upsetting, but it's something we already knew, that the US is in general, favors Israel when it comes to policies. What Trump did is just kind of revealed it much more. It wasn't something that, oh, wow, that's a huge, obviously very, very upsetting for Palestinians, but wasn't the biggest surprise. I would say I'm not as energized by the changes in the US government. I'm not as a huge I'm not as I just had a talk with somebody in the policy in the U.S. government, the policy area yesterday, and he said the Biden administration is not going to be focused on Israel and Palestine. Everyone knows that. They're not really focused on most stuff in foreign affairs. They focused on internal issues, and that's what they're going to be focused on. This is the most important right now. So I'm not holding a lot of faith in the US government. I do see changes among people, definitely among Jewish community, I think, and that's a attribute to education, to work of organizations like Combatants for Peace, who are going around and talking about the issues. I find that the biggest problem we have is ignorance, like the issue of Sheikh Jarrah, people talking about it as property dispute, which is nonsense at all, or so on. The issues, there are other issues in Jerusalem we could have covered that we had not time for. So I think the more people are educated about the realities, the more they're willing to listen, to hear other views than what they know already, you'll see more and more changes among people.
So yeah, I'll try to answer another question, which is what gives you hope? I think what Aziz just answered is that. But I think on many levels, we have people here in both Israel and Palestine that just understand that this situation is not going to end unless we find a way to solve it with one another. And there is understanding of that. And I think that understanding is kind of seeking into even the governments and even the people that make the call here. And we had a government decision in Jerusalem. It was 3 years ago. The government decision talked about how East Jerusalem for 50 years was neglected and how money has to be invested in East Jerusalem and in the Palestinian community in East Jerusalem in order to make a change. Now we're talking about a minimal sum. Yeah, we're talking about 2 billion shekels, which is about, let's say, $500 million US dollars. And we're talking about money which is going to Israeli education, so kind of trying to indoctrinate the story. But for the first time, we saw a government that is talking about understanding that there's another group living here, which is not going to go away. Or when you're talking about the last coalition that just started 2 or 3 weeks ago, it's for the first time in many years, or at least the first time in this way, that we see Muslim or Arab Israeli, Palestinian citizens of Israel, who are in that Israeli coalition. And obviously, it's not great friendship and not great love. Another Arab party in the parliament is criticizing the first one of Mansour Abbas, the Islamic movement. And still, I think we see some understanding that if nobody's going to go anywhere, and also if we don't find a way to solve, you live here and we live there, and to have kind of a very beautiful peace agreement, then there must be a shared society here. And I think many people or more people are understanding that before. It could be my wishful thinking, and it's not necessarily the case, but I actually hope that it is.
I agree. Do Muslims also believe that the Dome of the Rock is where Ibrahim was about to sacrifice Ishmael, the parallel story? No, we don't. Muslims don't. It's believed that it was in the Arabia desert, in where now Saudi Arabia is. The Arabian desert. So definitely not. I think the importance comes from a different point of view. So from the Prophet coming to Jerusalem, Prophet Muhammad, and a magical animal called Al-Buraq, or creature called Al-Buraq, and then going up to meet with God, meets all the prophets in Jerusalem. That's really where the holiness come to the place, not from the same story. Muslims do believe that Abraham was about to sacrifice Ishmael, just not in the same location. And then somebody's asking, I'd like to hear your thought also about this one, Shai, which is our thoughts about the demonstrations and violence in Ramallah and other areas in the West Bank regarding the death of a well-known activist who was arrested by the PA. What is the future of the PA, the Palestinian people, in terms of having elections and a representative government? We should do a whole other conversation on this one. Yeah. But I'll tell you this. The only thing I have problem with this question is the word death, because it was not death. It was already, we know from the autopsy that it was a homicide, it was an assassination. Whether it was ordered political assassination or not is obviously something we could disagree on. I actually think it wasn't just rogue officers who did it. But I think the Palestinian Authority feels a lot of pressure. Since 1994, they have promised creating a Palestinian state, creating an independence. That was the whole concept of starting the Palestinian Authority. And many years have passed, 27 years now since then, and we have nothing to show for it. If anything, many Palestinians will tell you things have got worse since. So how do you justify the Palestinian Authority existence is really hard. It's not just an issue of elections. It's not just an issue of how do you have representative leadership. It's an issue of strategy. It's an issue of what's our vision. What do you do next? How do you move forward? And the moment we allow ourselves to have a self-rule as is happening, Shai, in the beginning, you showed the West Bank map. The Palestinian Authority only actually controls about 15% of the West Bank. That's it. The rest of the West Bank is not controlled by the Palestinian Authority. So many Palestinians look at that and wonder why? Why accept this reality? And then why would Israel be willing to even give us anything more? Because the Palestinian Authority is containing Palestinians, dealing with all the issues from healthcare to governance to so on, makes the occupation much easier. And it's in some ways, some Palestinians now are starting to see it as an indirect occupation, helping the occupation of the West Bank. So today there were news that President Abbas has left to Jordan to talk to the Jordanian king. News says that he hasn't returned yet, that he's staying there. There's a lot of people angry about the killing of Nizar Banat, who's a very prominent activist, but also more so even about the protests and the way the protests have been met by the Palestinian security, extreme violence against activists who are being beaten up by civilian clothed security forces, arrests of journalists, all of that. That is, it's important to talk about. And I think it's important for people to know that Palestinians are not aiming to change one form of oppression from the Israeli government to a new form of oppression by the Palestinian government. That's not the goal. And so if there's one thing very encouraging for me right now, is seeing Palestinians making those protests and saying no to the Palestinian police and the Palestinian government, saying we're not going to accept being silenced, we're not going to accept being terrorized by this government.
Yeah,
Shai.
I was kicked out of the session, so I missed part of your answer. But I want to give my I don't know, aspiration here. I think it's a scary moment to think about, because I think at one point we're seeing what the Palestinian people are talking about. We're seeing the aggression of the PA, and we're seeing the corruption of the PA, and we're seeing in the last couple of days people we see in the streets standing against the PA for all those things. Having said that, I don't know what will happen if the PA would crash, would fall down. And if that happens, then honestly, I don't know what the reaction of Israel would be. I don't know if Israel would interfere and would say, okay, this is the time that we kind of waited for, and now the Palestinian Authority is under such a problem, and if they crash down, then what's going to happen with the rest? So maybe Israel will take over, or another organization will take over. This is something that I honestly don't know, and I'm fearful of. So obviously, we want to see a change, and I'm happy that it's coming from the street itself, as unfortunate, of course, as the circumstances are.
I have a question from Jim that says, how do Israeli border control treat individuals arriving for a Majdi tours? To my knowledge, not much different than any other tours. It's not been an issue, partially because, look, we do tell the whole story. You heard today from us, we agree more or less, Shai and I, but we meet people who disagree with us, who will tell you that Shai and I are wrong. And so we don't I don't believe in promoting only the story that I believe in. I think you should hear even from those who disagree with us, so you understand the whole picture and understand why they disagree with our story. So we haven't had really problems with travelers coming in. Now, it depends on some individuals. If you are openly a BDS supporter, you could be denied entry to Israel by law, but that has nothing to do with Mejdi. You could also be denied entry if you are a Palestinian, from a Palestinian background, somebody who has family origin in Palestine, even if you grew up in the States. We've had some of those people who I knew coming and not getting in, again, not related to our tours, but I know people who have had that problem. But in general, we've run a few tours together already, combatants and Mejdi, and have not had any issue with people being able to come in. And I think we're coming towards almost towards the end. So I want to ask Beth to join us back. Hello, Beth.
Hello, everybody. So thank you so much for joining us. We're really grateful to have you. I know there's a lot of questions that got asked today that were not able to be answered. So I do apologize about that. And I would urge you to please check out our events page. I'll put the events link in the chat. So we have talks about every 10 days for the rest of the summer on all kinds of things. And we'd love for you to join more of these chats. And of course, we definitely want you to come join us in November. Shai and Aziz will definitely be, hopefully be with us. We even visit Aziz's mom's family's home for dinner one night. And Shai
only if you behave. Only if you behave, people.
And Shai was our tour guide for the first 2 tours. So these incredible humans are going to be with us, and we hope you can join us too. Please send me my email. I'll put it in the chat as well. And you should all get a reminder about the next tour in November. And I'm going to turn it over to Ben, one of our board members for Combatants for Peace, to close.
Well, Aziz and Shai, thank you so much. For all of you on this call, as a board member of Combatants for Peace, I would be American Friends of Combatants for Peace. I would be remiss if I didn't really emphasize the point that every dollar that comes to support Combatants for Peace comes from individuals. There aren't huge government entities or huge billionaires supporting us. It is the dollars that come from people like you and me that support the work of this organization, the movement on the ground, the activism, the bail to bail people out of jail when they are in fact arrested. Every dollar helps, and I would urge you to check out the link that is in the chat, the afcfp.org/donate, and help as best as you can. Even a few dollars a month is going to be really incredibly helpful. So thank you all very much. Thank you, Shai. Thank you, Aziz. And please check out one of our next events. Have a good day.